Okay, hello class. So today we are going to talk about fiction and specifically the meaning, function, importance, and forms of fiction. So as you may already know, with the end of the third quarter marks the end of our topic on poetry, and so now we move on to the other side of creative writing, which is writing fiction or writing prose. Now, specifically in creative writing, we discuss writing prose in the form of fiction because that's the essence of that's the essence or the most basic of writing of prose when it comes to creative writing. There are types of prose in creative writing that are non-fiction, which we call creative non-fiction, but that will be discussed later on in your grade 12 subject. So today we are going to talk about the meaning, function, and importance and forms of fiction. So before I go on to the meaning of fiction, I'll give you a few seconds to think about what fiction means to you. The word fiction, what does it mean to you as a person? What does it mean to you as a writer? What does it mean to you as a student? So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, so I hope that you have some idea of what fiction is to you. So let's go on to our lesson. And I hope that within this lesson, some of those ideas are clarified as well. So, the meaning of fiction. In the most basic meaning of fiction, it is literature created from the imagination. Okay, so we are using our imagination as the basis of what we are writing. It is not presented as facts. Remember that fiction and fact are two opposites of the spectrum. When it comes to fiction, there is no evidence that this has really happened. That's because it's imaginary. Okay, so we can have stories that are based on true stories or situations, much like personally I take a lot of inspiration from true life experiences, and I put that into my writing. A lot of people or a lot of movies and shows, especially if you watch a lot like Magpakailanman or Maalaala Mo Kaya, those are types of fiction that are based on true stories or situations, and they have been fictionalized or they have been creatively written to be more dramatic and to be more entertaining. So that's something that you can also do. Okay, that's something that you can also follow and write. Now we also have something called the origin of the word fiction. Okay, so the origin of the word fiction comes from the Latin word fictio. Okay, fictio is the Latin for the act of making, fashioning, or molding. So fiction in itself is making. The origin of the word fiction itself is from the word making or creating. Okay, so you're creating something out of simple inspiration or just out of your own imagination. And there are different types of literature which we will also discuss. We have the genres, which we will discuss later on in this quarter, and we have the forms, which are novel, short story, and novella, and many more that we'll discuss within this lesson as well. So that's the basic meaning of fiction. Okay, now let's go on to the function of fiction. So fiction functions within our culture, within our society, and it has different contributions and functions within a certain culture, within a certain society. So these are five or four of the most abundant functions of fiction. So these are the things that fiction contributes to our society, to our culture. Okay, so the first function of fiction is that fiction is written as an escape from reality. So especially now in the time of the pandemic, many people seek out an outlet not to be so they are not too exposed to the real world, because the real world is kind of stressful right now. So many people, especially if you're a writer, you're an avid reader and a writer, many people read and watch movies or watch TV shows so they can have a little bit of escape from the stress of society. It's also a good way for us to be entertained, because it's that escapism. It's that thought that, oh, we can leave our problems behind for a while and just watch this TV show, watch this movie, and have a good time. So it's not as if we are escaping reality in a bad sense. We are escaping reality because we just want to be entertained. We just want to have a little bit of fun while we are dealing with I don't know if you're dealing with anything, but while we are living in this sort of stressful time, or in any time really. Okay, so fiction as an escape from reality. Next, we have fiction is written as a commentary on contemporary events and culture. When we say a commentary on contemporary events and culture, this is when things are written as an expose piece. It's written as a reflection of what is happening in society right now. So, for example, if you know of Bob Ong, the Filipino author Bob Ong, most of his works there are commentaries on what is happening in Philippine society and Philippine culture right now. One of the most popular books that he has is MacArthur, which is a commentary on the struggle of the impoverished, a struggle and the problem of addiction within the Philippines in the modern time. So that is also something that fiction functions as. It helps also provide commentary. It helps provide a reflection and sort of an expose as well into what is happening in society, what is happening in the world right now that needs to be noticed. And sometimes if you don't see it in fiction, we don't notice it at all. There are a few examples of this in Western culture as well. If we look at 1984 by George Orwell, which is sort of a commentary on how if we continue to let dictatorships happen, then it will be just a police state where no one can think freely. So that's something that we can get from fiction as well. What sort of warnings of what will happen if we do not improve on the problems of society right now. Okay, so that's commentary on contemporary events and culture. Next is, fiction can also be written or is written to explain a concept. This is a common function of fiction, especially when we are writing children's stories or children's books. Of course, it is quite hard to explain the concept of kindness, the concept of love, the concept of camaraderie and friendship to children. So many people, many writers or cultures use stories, folklore, or children's stories to explain to children why they should be good people, why they should be compassionate, why they should be hardworking, things like that. And a good example of this is, of course, if you want to teach children to how to be hardworking instead of lazy, you can teach them about the ant and the grasshopper. Okay, so another example, if you want to teach children humility and not to be complacent with their achievements, you can also teach them. You can tell them the story of the tortoise and the hare. So those are just examples or common examples of how we can write fiction to explain certain concepts. This is also done in adult or young adult fiction as well. Simon and the Homo sapien agenda is a good way to explain coming out and being open with yourself and sexuality as a person. It's a good way. It's a good way to explain that concept to teenagers and young adults. To adults as well, we can turn to other books like Turtles All the Way Down to explain mental health and mental illness. Um, uh, there, there are so many good examples of fiction that explain certain concepts that when we just read it, when we read it as fact, sometimes it's hard to digest because there are so many technical terms, there are so many words, there are so many points of view. But if we read it as a story, if we read it as a work of fiction, it's much easier to digest. It's much easier to process because there is a certain relatability to it. You can relate to the characters. You can relate to the events that are happening within the story. So it's good to sometimes explain certain concepts in fiction as well. Okay, so that's fiction being written to explain a concept. Next is fiction is how we explore metaphorical and metaphysical concepts. In the third one, they're just broad concepts of love, friendship, things like that. But here, metaphorical and metaphysical concepts, these are more of the fantastical sides of of thinking. So sometimes we need certain stories to help us think of who we are metaphysically. So our beliefs, our fundamental understanding of how the world works. And sometimes fiction is a good way of explaining that. Okay, so there are many books of fiction that are somewhat metaphorical and metaphysical. They can be fantasy, sci-fi, and they get good, and they explain really good. They have really good explanations on certain concepts. For example, there are certain novels like Star Wars. The novelization of Star Wars is a good symbolism of the journey of the hero's journey, which is a good metaphysical journey as well, how a person can grow throughout their lives. So that's something that's very metaphysical. That's something that's very anchored in a belief system. So another thing that we can get from fiction as we explore these concepts is, of course, how we anchor our beliefs, how we anchor how certain stories are anchors or can be basis of our beliefs and philosophies. I know a lot of people and both writers and readers who use certain pieces of literature as the basis of their beliefs in life. For example, yun nga yung earlier when I told you about some stories being used to teach children morals. So that's also true in larger examples of fiction as well. And last, we have fiction is mankind's outlet to shed all inhibitions on a structured, relatable level and truly explore our humanity. So, a good way to explore what makes us human is to read and write fiction. Because there are so many stories to be shared, so many thoughts to be heard, and so many people who would like to share those stories. And sometimes we are shy, sometimes we are too introverted, we can't explore and we can't express those. And we can use fiction, we can use writing to explore feelings that we thought we felt that we thought that we were alone in feeling. Personally, as an introvert myself, I like to use writing as an outlet, as writing of stories as an outlet to tell my story in a creative way or in a derivative way, of course. And when I was posting, in the time that I was posting my stories, many people commented on how they could relate or how they could um identify themselves within the characters of my stories, because that happened to them also, because they were feeling the same way as the characters, or essentially feeling the same way as I was. And in that level, there is more connection to our humanity, that, oh, I'm not the only one feeling like this, oh, I'm not the only one who's experienced this, there are people out there like me. And that's such a good function of fiction, because it brings us together. Okay, in a time where everything is so divided, it's good that we have certain outlets where we can express ourselves without any inhibitions. When we say inhibitions, these are limitations, shyness, things like that. And we can just share with each other and just explore what makes us human, what binds us together as humans, or as the human race. So that is the fifth and last function of fiction. So these are just general functions, okay? So you may find other functions of fiction that lie underneath these general functions. So if you have anything to share about that, you can bring it up, or you can contact me. We can talk about those other functions as well. So those are the functions of fiction. The next part of our lesson is the importance of fiction. Why is fiction important? So, or why are stories in general important to us as a human race, as a culture, as a society? Why are fiction, or why are stories important? So here's the first thing. First is that stories or fiction gives us good truths. Every story has a variation of Robert Frost Two Road. Okay? Lagi yang may dalawang lagi yang may dalawang pupuntahan, either good or bad. But in the first importance of fiction is that we always, in these types of stories, we always learn that choices are made and consequences are met. That is life. So within the fiction, we are also taught about how to function in reality. Stories show us the good truths, the possibilities for joy, wholeness, happiness, peace, sanity, love. And when we make the right choices, those are all possible for us. Even if we make the wrong choices, which I will discuss later on. Even if stories also teach us that even if we make the wrong choices, the people, there is still a possibility of achieving all of these things. So there are certain stories, certain pieces of fiction that just give us hope that the world isn't all bad as well. Okay, so that's the first importance of fiction, that it gives us good truths. Next, we have stories open our minds and teach us empathy. So, as I was discussing earlier in one of the functions of fiction, sometimes it's hard to teach children certain aspects. And something that makes understanding children very hard is that they don't have the capacity for empathy yet. It takes a long time, and even as adults, sometimes many adults I know are not as empathetic as they should be. So sometimes stories help open our eyes to the larger world around us, meaning that stories can help us realize that it is not just us that lives in the universe, and that the world will not always adjust to who we are. So we can discover many things, we can discover many places just by reading certain stories. And of course, we get a glimpse of other people's souls, the writer's soul, the characters. Okay, so again, as an introvert personally, most of the interactions most of the social interactions that I base myself on are the ones that I read in stories. So how do I interact with people well? And so I base them on the stories that I've read. So that is the power of the story. it is a window into the greater truths of the world at large. So there are so many stories in the world that express so many good truths that it can really give us a good look on what the world is like even outside of our small little bubble. Okay, again, as an introvert, I have a very short list of friends, and so I'm not very exposed to other people. Even with my family, we're all very much alike. But when I read stories, when I read stories from other cultures, stories from uh, other places, stories from other times, I get a sense of how they lived and who they were and what these people were like and how I could be more empathetic towards them. So that's a good thing. That's a very good importance of stories or fiction. Next is stories offer us archetypal role models. Okay? So when we say archetypal role models, these are heroes. Okay? To be honest, life isn't full of good people. There are a lot of bad people in the world, and sometimes we struggle to find people to look up to in life. So books and stories change our life because they reflect our lives. Sometimes we identify with Harry Potter, the struggle of being an outsider in his own home. We can relate to their similarities. Okay, so if you are an outcast, you can find many characters who feel like they don't belong in their story, so they do something about it. Um, so that's why we have the Avengers here, because sometimes archetypal role models are heroes. They have superpowers. They have so many abilities, but in reality, we can also have people who are just who throw off their shackles, who make the choice to free themselves from their insecurities and doubts and fears. And that's something that we can really look up to, because as I said, sometimes in real life, outside of fiction, it's hard to find people to look up to like that. So let's find someone. So sometimes we turn to fiction to find someone to look up to, who will shake off their fear, who will conquer their challenges, their doubts, their insecurities. We can rely on them to make the right choices, things like that. So that's something that really is a big importance of fiction, especially nowadays when there is really a lot of struggles and hardships going on, not just in the world but maybe as you as well. Okay. Next is stories teach us how to hope. There are many stories of hope, many stories of love and fear and getting to getting to the point where we can lose hope. But in many stories, hope is the spark that lights the fire. So sometimes in the struggle, it can be incredibly, ridiculously easy to pour our entire focus into the mud at our feet. So we just focus on our battles. But sometimes stories remind us and they show us that the big picture of another person's struggle, remind us that we are not surrendering to darkness, rather than we are walking through darkness to the light. So a lot of especially now, a lot of stories are coming out. Stories of hope, stories of love, stories of peace, things that we really need in our lives today. And sometimes, just like in the first function of fiction, sometimes we need to escape the problems and just read these stories to remind us that hope exists, that there is still hope. Okay, so if we can't find hope in reality, let's find hope in the stories and in the fiction that we've read. So that is the segment on the importance of fiction. Next, we have the forms of fiction. So this is the last segment of our lesson for this week. So I know it's a bit short, but this is one of the most important things that you need to learn. The forms of fiction, how these are based on the length. Most commonly, fiction is categorized, or the forms of fiction are categorized about on their length, how short or how long they are. Okay, so the first form of fiction is flash fiction. Flash fiction, it's called flash fiction because you can read it in a flash. Okay, you can read it when you're in a hurry. You can read it in quite. You can usually read it as it's as easy as scrolling through your feed, your social media feed. Um, these types of flash fiction are, it's generally an umbrella term. There are so many terms for flash fiction. There's microfiction, dribble, drabble, when we say postcard fiction. So there are many terms for flash fiction, but the overall term that we use is flash fiction. So these are 1,000 words or less. That's why it's called flash fiction. You can read it in a flash. If you're in a hurry, just want to read something, this is the type of fiction for you. If you just want a quick read, okay, and it's also a quick write, okay. So it's still, remember that it still provides a compelling story. Okay, there's still a plot, there's still a beginning, middle, and end. There are types of fiction that are so short that you can't easily identify the plot, but for example, there are 6-word stories and 2-sentence stories. So those are examples of flash fiction. So these types of flash fiction, again, they are written they are written and read in a quick succession. Kaya siya flash fiction. Okay. Next is the short story. Now, the short story is about 1,000 to 714 to 700 sorry, 7,499 words. Or sometimes there's variation to 1,000 to 8,000 words. That is still a short story. So it's brief, and due to its brevity, the narrative in a short story is condensed. Okay, so when we say condensed, it's very much fast paced. There is not a lot of exposition, there is not a lot of there is not a lot of unnecessary dialogue, there is not a lot of unnecessary narration, because we have to get it under a certain amount of words, which is under 8,000. So that's short story. Remember that short story is different from flash fiction due to its length. Short story is usually read, or a short story is usually read when you are having some off time. Maybe you can read it within an hour or so, things like that. Okay. Next is the novelette. The novelette is 7,500 or 8,000 to 19,999 words, or just under 20,000 words. So a novelette is a shorter form of the novella. The novella is and you will see this later. The novella is a much longer. It's quite long. And the difference between a short story and a novelette is that sometimes a novelette can have mini chapters or mini parts within the mini chapters within the novelette itself. So the 19,999 words, that can be divided into certain parts, which in the olden days, or in historically speaking, novelettes are sometimes published through daily newspapers or weekly periodicals, or weekly publications as installments. Okay, so people can still read it quickly, but there are different parts to it. That's why it's called a novelette. It's a shorter form of the novella and the novel. Okay, the term once implied a book that had a romantic, again, back in the olden days, historically speaking, novelettes were exclusively romantic or sentimental. Again, it was published in magazines and weekly periodicals, and it would attract attention of readers. So every week they would read. They would it's like following a series, but instead of on TV, it's in a newspaper. So that's why the novelette became popular is because it was published weekly or daily, and they would read the installments of the novelette, short installments of the novelette. So that's the novelette. The novella is different because it is longer than the novelette, almost twice or more than twice the length of a novelette, and it is the longest form of short fiction we have, because the novella is more expanded. Okay, there is more freedom to expand the story, there is more freedom to expand dialogue and character development, and the novella is also divided into different chapters as well. Okay, so when we say the difference between the short story, the novelette, and the novella, and also later on when we say the novel, just remember that a short story can be considered a movie. Okay, it can be done in an hour or two. It's very short. The novelette and the novella can be considered as short or mini-series. Okay, when we say mini-series, these are shows that are around for about 5 to 10 episodes only. They are not long-lasting stories. Okay, they are just short things that we can watch per installment. Okay, the novel naman. Okay, so the next type is novel. This can be considered the series or a long series. So for example, the movie, the mini series, and the full series, wherein we can find different episodes, different seasons. Okay, so sometimes novels have sequels, so sometimes a series that we like has a season 2. Okay, so that's the novel. So it is a minimum of 80,000 words. That's the minimum of a novel. I've spoken to a lot of my writer friends, and some of them are trying to get their novels published, and a lot of publications won't accept anything lower than 100,000 words. So it really depends on how we define the length. Okay, so the novel is complex. Okay, so there's a certain complexity to the novel, which is often used to gauge the standards for other literary forms pertaining to structure, plot, characterization, and what good writing should look like overall. Of course, there are so many examples of the novel. I myself, my favorite novels are the Hunger Games series. So that's 3 novels. So if you are going to compare it to video or to TV, that's season 1, season 2, and season 3 of the same series. Okay, so novels are no longer considered to be short fiction, because mostly novels can be read if you're a normal person, if you're not like me, and you actually go outside, a certain novel can be read in 2 to 5 days, depending on the length, if it's quite long. But I can usually finish novels within a day or two, because sometimes I will forget that the outside world exists and I need to eat. So don't be like that. But yeah, the novel is no longer considered to be short fiction. So everything else before this, the flash fiction, short story, novelette, and novella, those are considered short fiction because they can be read in quite a short period of time. But the novel itself, you have to really plan out a significant amount of time to read this certain piece of fiction. And if you think the novel is the longest form of fiction we'll discuss, you would be wrong, because there is something called the epic novel. An epic novel is the beast of the literary world, because it is quite hefty, it is quite long. The minimum is 120 words. That's just the minimum. The minimum is 120 to 200,000 words. So these are just the minimum ranges. So it can be upwards of 200,000 words. And what makes the epic novel epic is that there is heroic and poetic tales such as Gilgamesh, the Iliad, Beowulf. Here are some examples of modern heroic or epic novels. The 100 Years of Solitude, one of my favorite novels. The Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror novel by H.P. Lovecraft. If you haven't heard of it, I suggest you take it up. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. This is about aliens invading the Earth. Blood Rights, Going Postal, and Fear No Loading in Las Vegas. Now, other types of epic novels would be The Lord of the Rings. Okay, each book in that trilogy would be considered an epic novel because there's a certain sense of world building and fantasy within that, and it makes it so that these novels are so long, and so there is such a deep and rich background to all of the characters, to all of the cultures, and even in, like I said, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there is such a wide background to all of these people, to all of the stories, the characters, that it really reaches the level of epic, wherein there's an entire world that has been created through this novel. Okay, so that's why it's called epic, because it's so long and there's this epic heroic journey that happens within the novel itself. Okay, so that is the last form of fiction. Now, I know that you can't ask me questions directly right now, but if you do have any questions, you can feel free to ask me through my email, jdomingo@ucc.ph, or you can message me on Facebook if we are already connected on there. Now, you can ask me questions about the lesson. Now, for your activity for this lesson, of course, we need to measure whether or not we've learned something from our lesson. The activity, we will not have a performance task or a standard for performance task for this lesson, but we will be having a 10-item quiz. So that will be assigned along with the posting of this video. I will assign that to you late through our Google Classroom. So it's a fairly easy quiz, but please still study for that as well. Okay, so that's a 10-item quiz. The deadline of that will be 2 days after I post this video. Okay, so you have 2 days to answer the 10-item quiz. I believe that's enough time. So that is all for this lesson video. Remember to take the quiz, remember to study for that, and without further ado, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you when I see you. Thank you for watching.